This is episode 3, Dimensions of Seeing, part 1. In the previous episode, we explored what it means to see another human being as a human being. Now we move into a deeper question beneath all of it. What does it actually mean to see? Most people assume seeing is simple. You open your eyes, objects appear, the process seems complete. But perhaps seeing is far more complex than we realize, because the moment something appears, the mind immediately begins moving. Labels appear, memories appear, judgments appear, associations appear, stories begin forming. And often all of this happens so quickly that we no longer distinguish between what was actually seen and what the mind added afterwards. So in this episode, we will explore several dimensions of seeing: meeting the object, awareness, outer and inner objects, and direct perception. So these are the 4 dimensions that we shall be seeing. Because perhaps seeing clearly is not one simple act, it is a living movement. And understanding that movement may be one of the beginnings of mental clarity. Before we begin, it may help to clarify something. The dimensions in this episode are related because they all are somehow connected to seeing, but they are not the same. One dimension cannot replace another. Meeting the object, which was one of the dimensions we talked about, cannot replace awareness. Awareness cannot replace seeing inner and outer objects. And direct perception cannot replace either meeting the object or awareness. Each dimension reveals something different about seeing. Meeting brings contact. Awareness brings presence. Seeing inner and outer objects widens what we include in perception. And direct perception shows us what is encountered before thought adds labels, judgments, and stories. So the purpose is not to choose one dimension over another, it is to understand how each contributes to clearer seeing. Now let's get into the first dimension, meeting the object. Imagine looking at a rose. For most people, the process is extremely quick. The eye sees the flower, the mind says rose, and the seeing largely ends there. The label replaces the living object. But if you remained with a flower for a few more seconds, something interesting begins happening. Details begin appearing that were not initially noticed. Shades of red, tiny curves in the petal, imperfections, the softness of the edges, the way light falls across the surface. The object did not change, attention changed, and perhaps this happens constantly in human life. The mind concludes too quickly that it already knows what something is, and the moment conclusion enters, attention fades. One of the famous places to watch a sunrise in India is Kanyakumari, where the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean meet. 3 bodies of water meeting at one place. Our family traveled a long distance to see it together. We woke up early on a cold, windy morning and walked quietly towards the terrace to watch the sunrise across the water. But the sky was cloudy, so we returned again the next morning. Again, this morning was not any less cold and not any less windy. So we waited. This time the sunrise slowly appeared. The colors spread across the horizon, gold, orange. It was just amazing. Reflections across the moving water. People stood quietly watching. Then suddenly someone nearby said loudly, "I came all the way for this? I can see this in my hometown." And something changed immediately. The labeling entered. Comparison entered, conclusion entered, and the seeing ended. The sunrise was no longer being met directly. Thought had entered perception, and perhaps this is one of the strange movements of the mind. The moment it concludes, it already knows. The living quality of seeing often disappears. Take something even simpler, a pencil. Most people would say there is nothing interesting about it, it's just a pencil. But sit down with it quietly for 10 seconds, not to analyze it scientifically, not to think about it, just to look. Suddenly, details begin emerging. The texture of the wood, tiny scratches, differences in color, the shape worn down by use. The object was always there, but most of the time, seeing stopped at recognition. Perhaps human beings often live this way, recognizing without truly meeting. The same thing happens with human beings. We may see a person without truly meeting them: a cashier, a driver, a cleaner, a co-worker, a stranger on the street. The eyes register the person, the mind identifies the role, but the human being may not actually be met. They become a function: someone who serves us, someone who delays us, someone who interrupts us, someone who belongs to a category. And once the label enters, seeing often stops. We do not see their tiredness, their effort, their fears, their hopes, their ordinary wish to be treated with dignity. To see a human being without meeting them is to reduce them to what they are for us. To meet them is to allow them to appear as a human being in their own right. In the middle class environment in which I grew up, it was common for families to have a household help. They did not sit on the living room furniture. They also did not eat at the dining table with us. The arrangement was considered ordinary. I accepted without question. Only later, while reflecting on systems that treated some human beings as lesser, did I begin noticing that my own seeing had also been shaped by quiet assumptions of hierarchy. No one had to explicitly tell me to see another human being as less important. It entered through repetition, culture, habit. I was not truly seeing a human being, I was seeing a role. And that realization stayed with me, because if perception can divide so quietly, then perhaps the question is not only what we believe, but how we see. Now let us look at something more subtle. Meeting an object is rarely neutral. The mind carries memory, preference, association, and emotional history into what it meets. John loves the sound of the bamboo flute. Over the years, the instrument has become associated with beauty, calmness, depth, and admiration within him. So when he sees a flute among many instruments, it already stands out. It is not merely noticed, it is highlighted by preference. Now imagine John is interviewing candidates for a position. One candidate casually says, "I play the bamboo flute really well." In that moment, something subtle happens internally. The flute is no longer merely an instrument, it becomes an association. A quiet warmth appears, a sense of familiarity, perhaps even admiration. John may now listen more closely, feel slightly more drawn towards the candidate, evaluate her more favorably, even though nothing about her actual ability for the job has yet been verified. Another equally qualified candidate who does not trigger that association may now be met with less warmth, less curiosity, less inner openness. Nothing changed in the candidates themselves. What changed was the lens through which they were being met. And perhaps this happens constantly in human life. Preference quietly shapes attention. Memory quietly shapes openness. Association quietly shapes judgment. So the difficulty is often not with vision itself. Reality may be present in the whole time. The difficulty is with contact. Because the moment something appears, something else quietly arrives along with it. Memory, comparison, expectation, association, and of course, story. And what is actually here is gradually replaced by what the mind already knows or what it imagines may happen next. Meeting the object can happen mechanically. The eyes register the flower, the mind says rose, the process completes automatically. So the object has been met only as a function of recognition, not as a living act of seeing. And perhaps much of human life operates this way. automatic recognition, automatic labeling, automatic conclusion, without real attention remaining with what is being encountered. Meeting an object does not end with perception alone. The meeting affects the self also. A compliment appears and pleasure arises. A criticism appears and hurt arises. A luxury car appears and comparison begins. A photograph appears and memory awakens. So objects are not merely seen, they also trigger movements within the mind. Desire, fear, pleasure, pain, attachment, and even resistance. And often this happens so quickly that human beings assume the reaction is part of the object itself, but the object and the reaction are not exactly the same movement. A manager's email appears, immediately tension forms in the body. Thought begins projecting, what did I do wrong? Am I in trouble? Now the mind is no longer simply meeting the email. It is meeting the psychological movement awakened by the email. And perhaps much of human life unfolds this way. Objects constantly touching the structure of the self strengthen it, threaten it, comfort it, and also disturb it. So meeting the object is not a passive event. The meeting changes the inner state of the mind itself, and perhaps clearer seeing begins the moment the mind notices not only the object being met, but also the movement the object awakens within the self. Perhaps meeting begins the moment the mind slows down enough to remain with what appears. Not to force concentration, not to analyze endlessly, but simply to stay present a little longer before thought rushes towards conclusion. Because perhaps much of life is never truly met. It is rapidly categorized, named, judged, compared, and moved past. But when the mind remains quietly with what appears, something different begins happening. The object becomes alive again. And perhaps the world itself begins becoming alive again. Now let's move into the much awaited dimension 2, awareness. But now we move one step deeper, because even if the mind meets an object, another question still remains. Is the mind aware while it is meeting it? Meeting and awareness are related, but they are not the same movement. Meeting is a voluntary, time-bound focal act. You deliberately examine the pencil. You remain with the flower instead of instantly moving away mentally. Awareness is broader. It is more ongoing and less forced state in which experience is being noticed while life unfolds. You may be aware of the room, sounds, bodily sensations, thoughts, emotions, and even reactions without deliberately focusing deeply on any one object. So one can be aware without specifically meeting an object. And one can also meet an object mechanically without much awareness at all. A person may develop the habit of observing many details of objects. They meet a rose and begin carefully noticing the petals, the color variations, the texture, the fragrance, the symmetry. Over time, this itself can become a learned pattern. Now, when a pencil appears, the same process starts automatically. The mind begins scanning details, the shape, the texture, the sharpened tip, the paint, the markings. So the person is meeting the object in greater detail than before. But this can still happen mechanically. The mind has simply formed a new habit. When an object appears, observe many aspects of it. So detailed observation alone is not the same as awareness. Awareness is not merely the quantity of details noticed. A camera may capture enormous details. A trained artist may instantly notice proportions and texture automatically. The deeper question is whether the mind is consciously present in the meeting or merely executing a learned pattern of observation. So even careful observation can occur without awareness. And this is why meeting the object and awareness are independent dimensions. One can have mechanical seeing with little detail, mechanical seeing with great detail, aware seeing with little detail, or aware seeing with rich contact and detail. Meeting deepens contact with a particular object. Awareness widens the field within which experience is happening. And when both operate together, seeing becomes richer and clearer. What is awareness? Perhaps the simplest way to understand awareness is this. The opposite of awareness is auto mode, that is, automatically working on something. Much of human life happens automatically. We drive while thinking about something else, eat without tasting, react without noticing we are reacting. Someone criticizes us and defensiveness instantly appears. Someone praises us and pleasure immediately carries the mind away. Awareness is different. Awareness is the mind noticing what is happening while it is happening, not afterwards. In the moment itself, you are angry and aware anger is arising. You are becoming defensive and aware defensiveness is beginning. You are thinking and aware thinking is happening. Awareness does not mean controlling experience. It means seeing experience while it unfolds. Imagine someone says to John, "You should have done that differently." Usually, the reaction begins almost immediately. They don't respect me. They always criticize me. I'm tired of this. But awareness changes something subtle. The words are still heard, but now the mind also notices what is happening within itself while hearing them. The tightening, the emotional reaction, the defensive thought beginning to form. Of course, the story trying to build momentum. Nothing is suppressed, but now the reaction is being seen while it is happening. And that is completely different from unconscious reaction. A person can be aware and still not fully meet what is being encountered. A colleague makes a comment. Awareness may be present in a general way. You may notice the room, the sound of the voice, the tightening in the body, even the first movement of reaction. But if you do not actually stay with the colleague and the comment for a few moments, the mind may still react immediately. It labels, it defends, it assumes intention, it builds a story. So awareness alone is not enough. Meeting brings depth and contact to what is being encountered. Awareness widens the field in which that meeting happens. And when both operate together, like we talked about before, seeing becomes richer and clearer. Let's look into an example about watching anger arise. John is driving home after a long day. Another car suddenly cuts in front of him. Instantly, anger surges. Usually, the whole process happens automatically. Horn, thought, judgment, reaction. But one day, something slightly different happens. John notices the anger while it is rising, not afterwards. In the moment itself, he notices the tightening in the jaw, the heat in the body, the impulse to attack, the rapid thought trying to justify the reaction. And strangely, in that moment of awareness, a little space appears. The anger is still there, but now it is no longer completely unconscious. Now consider something very ordinary. Eating. Most people rarely fully taste their food. The meal is mixed with television, phones, thinking, planning, and of course, habit. The food enters the mouth, but awareness is somewhere else entirely. But occasionally something changes. The texture becomes vivid. The temperature becomes vivid. The movement of chewing becomes noticeable. The flavors become clearer. Nothing magical has happened. Awareness simply became present. And perhaps this reveals something important. Life itself is often not shallow. What is shallow is the quality of attention we bring to it. Now we move even deeper, because awareness is not limited to physical objects or external events. thought itself can also be seen. A memory appears, a fantasy appears, a fear about tomorrow appears. Usually the mind becomes absorbed immediately. The thought carries us away. But sometimes awareness is present at the very beginning. The mind notices thinking is happening, not as an idea, as a direct observation. And suddenly the relationship changes. The thought is still there, but it is also being seen. At this point, an important misunderstanding must be cleared up. Awareness is not suppression. It is not forcing the mind to become quiet. It is not pretending to be peaceful. In fact, awareness may reveal that the mind is not peaceful at all. Fear, jealousy, loneliness, conflict could have occupied the mind. But seeing these clearly is already different from blindly acting from them. Awareness does not instantly solve every problem, but it changes the relationship to what is happening, and perhaps real change begins there. Without awareness, reaction quickly takes over perception. The mind becomes pulled from one movement to another. Pleasure pulls in one direction, fear. Then you have irritation, and then something from memory shows up. And of course, the famous story starts building. But awareness introduces something subtle into human life: space, a small distance between perception and reaction, a small pause before the mind is completely carried away. And perhaps inside that space, there is the beginning of freedom from automatic reaction. So now let's move into dimension 3. External and internal objects. Seeing does not end with the outer world. Most people think seeing belongs only to the outer world. Objects, people, buildings, sounds, and events. But much of human life is also happening inwardly. Thoughts, memories, fears, desires, images, and of course, emotions. And if these inner movements remain unseen, then half of human life remains invisible to us. Tomorrow, John has an important meeting at work. Outwardly, nothing dangerous is happening, but inwardly, thought begins projecting into the future. What if I fail? What if they reject my idea? Soon, tension begins appearing in the body. Restlessness, anxiety. Now something important can be seen. The future event is not actually happening yet, but inwardly fear has already become real in experience. And if this movement is not seen clearly, it quietly begins shaping behavior. Someone walks past John without greeting him. The external fact is simple. A person walked by. But inwardly, the story immediately begins. They must be upset with me. Did I do something wrong? They don't respect me anymore. Now the mind is no longer meeting the event directly. It is meeting the story built around the event. And this happens constantly in human life. And now let's move into the last dimension in this episode, dimension 4, direct perception. What is direct perception? Direct perception means encountering something before the mind immediately adds something to it, like labels or judgments or stories. Your senses are the gateways through which this happens: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and last of all, smell. Each delivers raw information before thought begins organizing it into conclusions. The coolness of a surface, the pitch of a voice, the bitterness of a sip, and the scent of rain on dry ground. To perceive directly is to meet these sensations before the mind adds quickly: good, bad, useful, annoying, or even the name of the thing itself. But direct perception is not limited to the physical senses. The mind is presented with objects directly. Memories, imagined scenes, remembered sounds, and recalled smells, and tastes. When you close your eyes and suddenly hear your mother's voice from 10 years ago, the mind is presenting sound internally. When you remember the rough texture of tree bark touched years ago, the mind is presenting touch internally. So, direct perception includes both outer and inner experience, the world encountered through the senses and the world appearing inwardly through memory, imagination, and recall. Only afterwards does thought begin adding interpretation, inference, judgment, and story. In this episode, we explored several dimensions of seeing. We began with meeting the object. We saw that most of the time the mind quickly labels what appears, and the moment labeling concludes, the process deeper seeing often ends. A rose becomes merely rose. A human being becomes merely a role. A sunrise becomes merely something already known. We then explored awareness, the difference between mechanically registering something and being aware while experience unfolds. We saw that awareness is not control. It is the noticing of thoughts, emotions, reactions, sensations, and movements while they are happening. We explored outer and inner objects, not only the external world of people, sound, and events, but also the internal world of memory, fear, imagination, desire, and thought. We saw that much of human suffering and confusion happens inwardly through stories, projections, and psychological movements. And finally, we explored direct perception, encountering something before the mind immediately judges, labels, explains, or concludes. Examples are the coolness of a surface, the sound of a voice, the scent of rain, and the direct movement of memory appearing inwardly. And we saw that only afterwards does thought begin adding interpretation, meaning, inference, and story. So perhaps seeing is far richer than simple visual contact. Perhaps seeing includes meeting, awareness, outer and inner perception, and direct encounter before interpretation takes over. And so the definition we have reached so far is this: seeing is the movement through which the mind meets objects externally and internally with awareness and direct perception. And perhaps clearer seeing begins the moment the mind starts noticing not only what appears, but also what the mind itself is adding to what appears. Now let's look at the conclusion of this episode. Seeing is the movement through which the mind meets reality, outwardly and inwardly, with awareness through direct perception. And perhaps clearer seeing begins the moment the mind starts noticing not only what appears, but also what the mind itself is adding to what appears. In the next episode, we will explore the remaining dimensions of seeing, which are broad context, inference, trusted authority, and how objects and experiences give rise to painful, pleasant, and neutral states within the mind. Because perhaps understanding how experience is formed is one of the beginnings of understanding ourselves. Before we close, I would like to leave you with a simple image. Imagine a soft pillow in the shape of the earth, a soft earth, and imagine yourself holding it gently, hugging it, giving it all the love you can, because this earth includes all of us, humanity, animals, plants, and the environment. Everything living together on this small planet. Perhaps from time to time we can return to this image, a soft earth held with care. If you found something meaningful in this episode, please tell others about it. This is first steps to seeing reality, and perhaps the first step is simply to begin noticing. Thank you for listening.